I stared at the document on the polished mahogany desk, my boss's Mont Blanc pen rolling toward me like a loaded weapon. The non-disparagement agreement. 20 pages of legalese that boiled down to, shut up about everything you've seen here, or we'll destroy you. Sign it, Emma, Richard Hartwell said, his voice dripping with the kind of casual authority that came from never being told no. Sign it, and you get your severance. 6 months' salary. That's generous, considering. Considering what? Considering that I'd worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years? Considering that I'd built his company's entire client retention system from scratch? Considering that he'd stolen my ideas, harassed my coworkers, and run this place like his personal fiefdom? I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. Not this time. Because this time, I knew something Richard Hartwell didn't. I'd already won. Of course, I said, my voice steady and sweet. I'll sign. His eyes gleamed with triumph. That predatory satisfaction I'd seen so many times before. In another life, my first life, that look had made me feel small, powerless, like I was nothing more than an obstacle he'd successfully crushed. Now it just made me smile. I signed my name with a flourish. Emma Chen. The same signature I'd practiced 1,000 times in another timeline, on other documents, on the affidavit I'd submitted to the Department of Labor 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before I died. 3 weeks before I woke up 6 months in the past, in my cramped studio apartment, with a second chance and a burning clarity about exactly what I needed to do. Excellent, Richard said, sliding the document back across the desk. Debbie will process your final paycheck. You'll have it by Friday. Thank you, I said, standing. I smoothed my skirt, the same black pencil skirt I'd worn to my final confrontation last time, though I'd paired it with a red blouse instead of the meek beige one. Red for anger, red for blood, in the water. I appreciate your generosity. He didn't hear the sarcasm. Men like Richard never did. They heard what they expected to hear, saw what they wanted to see. It was their fatal flaw. I walked out of his office with my box of personal items, a coffee mug, a framed photo of my parents, the succulent that had somehow survived 3 years in this fluorescent hellscape, and rode the elevator down from the 15th floor for the last time. The last time in this timeline, anyway. Debbie from HR was waiting at my desk, her face arranged in that careful mask of professional sympathy that meant absolutely nothing. Emma, I'm so sorry about this. If there's anything I can do, there isn't, I said, cutting her off. In my first life, I'd believed her. I'd thought Debbie was an ally, someone who understood how toxic this place was. I'd confided in her about Richard's behavior, about the wage theft, about the systematic discrimination. She'd reported every word back to him. Well, Debbie said, her smile tightening, best of luck with everything. I loaded my box into my car and drove away from Hartwell Consulting Group for the last time, watching the sleek glass building shrink in my rearview mirror. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heart was calm. In my first life, I'd left this building broken. I'd signed the non-disparagement agreement because I was desperate. No job, no prospects, no money for rent. I'd taken the severance and disappeared, too afraid to speak up, too traumatized to fight back. I'd spent the next year barely surviving. Depression had swallowed me whole. I couldn't get another job in my field because Richard had quietly poisoned every well, telling anyone who called for a reference that I was difficult and unprofessional. I'd burned through my savings. I'd moved back in with my parents in their tiny Queens apartment, 30 years old and feeling like a complete failure. And then, on a rainy October night, I'd stepped off a curb without looking. The bus hit me at 40 miles per hour. I died instantly and woke up 6 months earlier, in my bed, to the sound of my alarm blaring at 6:00 a.m. on a Monday morning. At first I thought it was a dream, a vivid, impossible dream. But the details were too sharp, too real. The crack in my ceiling that the landlord had finally fixed 3 months ago was back. My coffee maker, which I'd replaced in April, was the old one again, the one with the broken timer. My work laptop showed the date, March 15th. I'd gone back. I'd actually gone back. The panic came first, then the disbelief, then, slowly, like dawn breaking, the understanding. I had a second chance, and I knew exactly what to do with it. I'd spent my first life being afraid, being compliant, being good, following the rules, trusting the system, believing that if I just worked hard enough and kept my head down, everything would work out. It hadn't. So this time I'd break every rule that needed breaking. This time I'd burned everything down. On March 16th, my second day back, I'd called the Department of Labor. I'd gathered every piece of evidence I could access, emails I'd saved to my personal drive, spreadsheets showing the systematic wage theft, how Richard routinely edited our time cards to cut overtime, how he classified us as exempt when we legally weren't, how he'd pocketed the difference, screenshots of the racist jokes he'd shared in the company's Slack, documentation of his sexual harassment, the comments he'd made to me and to Sarah and to every woman who'd ever worked for him. I'd compiled it all into a dossier that would make a prosecutor weep with joy, and I'd handed it to investigator James Morrison at the Department of Labor on March 23rd, sitting in a gray office that smelled like burnt coffee and bureaucratic justice. "This is extensive," he'd said, flipping through the pages. "You understand this might take time? Investigations like this?" "I understand," I'd said. "I'm willing to testify. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." He'd looked at me then, really looked at me. "Ms. Chen, if this is accurate, we're talking about serious violations. Your employer could face significant penalties. But I have to warn you, retaliation is illegal, but it happens. Are you prepared for that?" I'd thought about the bus, the moment of impact, the nothingness that came after. "Yes," I'd said. "I'm prepared." The investigation had begun immediately, quietly. The Department of Labor was good at being quiet when they needed to be. They'd started with the documents I provided, cross-referencing with their own records, building a case brick by brick. Richard had no idea. And while the investigation unfolded in the background, I'd gone to work every day. I'd smiled and nodded and played my part. I'd watched the same events unfold, the same clients, the same projects, the same casual cruelties. But I documented everything. Every violation, every illegal act. I'd been a spy in enemy territory, and Richard Hartwell had been too arrogant to notice. The timeline had diverged in small ways. Conversations went slightly differently. I made different choices in meetings. I avoided the mistakes I'd made before. But the broad strokes remained the same. Richard was still Richard. Debbie was still Debbie. The company was still rotten to its core. And in early September, right on schedule, Richard had called me into his office to fire me, just like before. He'd given me the same speech about restructuring and shifting priorities. He'd offered me the same severance package, contingent on signing the same non-disparagement agreement. But this time, it didn't matter. Because this time, the trap had already been set. I drove home to my apartment and opened my laptop. The email was waiting, just as I'd known it would be. From James Morrison, Department of Labor. Subject: Investigation update. I clicked it. Open. "Ms. Chen, I wanted to inform you that we have completed our investigation into Hartwell Consulting Group. Based on the evidence you provided and our subsequent findings, we will be moving forward with enforcement action. You should expect to see public filings within the next 2 weeks. We have documented the following violations: systematic wage theft affecting 47 current and former employees, totaling approximately $2.3 million in stolen wages and overtime, misclassification of employees to avoid paying legally required benefits, violations of workplace safety regulations, sexual harassment and hostile work environment, retaliation against employees who raised concerns. The penalties will be substantial. Additionally, our findings will be shared with the relevant state agencies, and we believe there is sufficient evidence for criminal charges related to wage theft and fraud. Thank you for your courage in coming forward. Cases like this are only possible when someone is willing to stand up. Best regards, James Morrison." I read it twice, then 3 times, letting the words sink in. $2.3 million. 47 employees, criminal charges. I'd done it. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a sad laugh, pure cathartic joy. Richard thought he'd silenced me with his non-disparagement agreement. He thought he'd won. He'd probably already forgotten about me, already moved on to his next victim. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of quiet anticipation. I job hunted, networked, reached out to contacts I'd made in my first life. I knew which companies were hiring, which managers were good to work for, which opportunities to pursue. I was, in effect, playing the career game with the cheat codes enabled. I landed 3 interviews in the first week, 2 offers by the second. I accepted a position at Morrison & Lee, a boutique consulting firm that paid 30% more than Richard had and actually treated their employees like human beings. I'd worked there briefly in my first life before the depression had made it impossible to function. Now, I'd get to start fresh, with all the knowledge I'd gained and none of the trauma. Well, almost none of it. On September 28th, the hammer fell. The Department of Labor issued a public order against Hartwell Consulting Group. It was a Friday, and the timing was perfect. Maximum news cycle impact, minimum time for Richard to mount a response before the weekend. The headlines rolled in. Consulting firm faces $4.2 million in penalties for wage theft harassment. Department of Labor investigation reveals systematic fraud at Hartwell Consulting. Employees speak out. It was like working for a dictator. The penalties had grown. What had started as $2.3 million in stolen wages had ballooned to $4.2 million once fines and punitive damages were added. The report was scathing. Every violation laid out in clinical detail. Every piece of evidence I'd provided, corroborated, and expanded. And my name was nowhere in it. The Department of Labor protected whistleblowers. My identity was sealed in the case file, inaccessible even through FOIA requests. Richard would never know who'd turned him in. But I knew, and that was enough. I watched the news coverage from my new apartment, a 1-bedroom in Brooklyn with actual sunlight and a dishwasher that worked. I'd signed the lease the day before, flush with my signing bonus and the confidence of someone who knew exactly how the next year would unfold. The reporters had found former employees willing to talk. Sarah Martinez, who Richard had fired after she reported his harassment. David Kim, who'd been forced to work off the clock for months. A dozen others, emboldened by the official investigation, finally willing to share their stories. He thought he was untouchable, Sarah said on camera, her voice steady and strong. He thought he could treat people however he wanted, and there would never be consequences. Well, here are the consequences. The local news ran the story as their lead. The business channels picked it up. Social media exploded. Former clients started severing contracts. Current clients demanded explanations. Hartwell Consulting Group's stock price, they'd gone public 2 years ago, and Richard's ultimate ego trip plummeted 40% in a single day. I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted the television screen. To consequences, I said aloud. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Is this Emma Chen? This is Tyler Rodriguez. We work together at Hartwell. I don't know if you've seen the news, but I wanted to reach out. Some of us are planning to file a class action lawsuit. The decel penalties are great, but we want our back wages and damages. Are you interested? I stared at the message. Tyler. I remembered him. A junior analyst who'd been fired 3 months after me in the original timeline. Smart kid, fresh out of grad school, crushed by Richard's toxicity before he'd barely started his career. In my first life, I'd never heard from him again. I typed back, I've seen the news, I'm very interested, let's talk. The lawsuit came together quickly. A law firm that specialized in employment cases took it on contingency. They knew a slam dunk when they saw one. With the Department of Labor's findings as a foundation, we had everything we needed. 23 former employees joined as plaintiffs. I was listed among them, just another name on a long roster of Richard's victims. Nothing to make me stand out, nothing to suggest I'd been the catalyst. The discovery process was brutal for Richard. Every email, every document, every piece of dirty laundry hauled out into the light. The lawyers deposed him for 8 hours, picking apart his lies, confronting him with evidence he couldn't deny. I wasn't there for it, but Tyler was. He texted me afterward. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. Just sat there stammering and sweating. It was beautiful. The case settled in January. Hartwell Consulting Group agreed to pay $8.5 million to the class members, plus legal fees. My share, based on years worked and documented damages, came to $340,000. More money than I'd ever had in my life. More than enough to erase every financial anxiety I'd carried, every sleepless night worrying about rent, every calculation about whether I could afford groceries or medication. But it wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about watching Richard Hartwell lose everything he'd built on the backs of people he'd exploited. The company collapsed in February. The combination of penalties, settlements, legal fees, and destroyed reputation was too much. They filed for bankruptcy. The remaining employees were laid off. The office building I'd walked out of 5 months ago was now empty, a for lease sign in the window. Richard tried to start a new company. He tried to rebrand, to distance himself from the scandal. But the internet is forever, and his name was poison. Clients wouldn't touch him. Investors ran away. Partners abandoned him. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to Phoenix, taking a middle management job at some corporate nothing. A tiny office, a small salary, no authority. Everything he'd had, gone. Everything he'd been, reduced to mediocrity. I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not pity, just a distant acknowledgement that the universe had corrected itself. By March, 1 year after I'd woken up in my old bed with impossible knowledge and a second chance, I was thriving. My job at Morrison & Lee was everything Hartwell Consulting had pretended to be. Reasonable hours, respectful colleagues, a boss who actually valued my work. I'd been promoted twice, my salary climbing steadily. I was saving money, making friends, going to therapy to process the trauma of both lives. I was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. On March 15th, the anniversary of my rebirth, I took myself out to dinner at an expensive restaurant in Manhattan. I ordered the tasting menu, paired wines with each course, let the sommelier guide me through flavors I'd never experienced. I was celebrating alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I felt victorious. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed. Another message from Tyler. "Hey, did you see this?" A link to a news article. I clicked it. Former CEO Richard Hartwell indicted on criminal fraud charges. My breath caught. The article was brief. The state attorney general had filed charges based on the Department of Labor's findings and evidence uncovered during the bankruptcy proceedings. Hartwell was facing up to 15 years in prison if convicted. 15 years. I set down my phone and picked up my wine glass. My hand was steady. "To justice," I whispered. I thought about my first life, the pain, the humiliation, the slow death of my spirit under Richard's regime, the bus that had ended it all. I thought about the choice I'd made when I woke up with a second chance, to fight back, to be brave, to refuse to be a victim. I thought about every woman who'd been harassed, every employee who'd been robbed, every person who'd been crushed by someone with power and no conscience. And I thought about the non-disparagement agreement sitting in Richard's files, my signature neat and clear at the bottom. He'd made me sign it after I'd already testified to the labor board, after I'd already handed over the evidence, after I'd already set the dominoes in motion. He thought he'd silenced me. He'd never realized I'd already spoken. The irony was exquisite. I finished my meal, left a generous tip, and walked out into the New York night. The city was alive around me. Car horns and laughter and the endless energy of millions of people chasing their dreams. I died here, in this city, been reborn here, found my voice here, and I'd won. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or setbacks or obstacles, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never be silent again. I walked home slowly, savoring the spring air, the possibility of tomorrow, the power of knowing that I'd rewritten my own story. The non-disparagement agreement Richard had made me sign was worthless. Not because I'd violated it. I hadn't spoken a single public word about Hartwell Consulting Group since signing. I'd let the Department of Labor speak for me. I'd let the evidence speak for itself. But because it had been signed too late, the damage was already done. And Richard Hartwell, who'd thought he was so clever, who'd thought a piece of paper could protect him from accountability, had learned the hardest lesson of his life. You can't silence the truth. You can only delay it. And sometimes, by the time you realize you should have been afraid, it's already too late to run. I smiled. As I unlocked my apartment door, stepping into the life I'd built from ashes and second chances. Tomorrow, I'd go to work. I'd meet with clients, lead meetings, contribute ideas that would actually be valued. I'd have lunch with Sarah. We'd reconnected and become genuine friends this time around. I'd call my parents and tell them about the promotion I was about to get. I'd live. Really, fully, completely live. But tonight, I'd sleep the sleep of someone who'd faced her demons and won. Who'd taken every ounce of pain and transformed it into power. Who'd been knocked down by a bus and gotten back up swinging. I changed into pajamas, washed my face, and climbed into bed. The sheets were expensive. Egyptian cotton, high thread count, the kind of luxury I never would have allowed myself before. I deserved them. I deserved all of it. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was of Richard, sitting in some mediocre apartment in Phoenix, probably drinking cheap scotch and wondering how it had all gone so wrong, and I laughed, because he'd never know. He'd never know it was me. He'd never know that the quiet, compliant Emma Chen he'd fired and forced to sign away, her voice had already destroyed him before he'd even handed her the pen. He'd never know that the woman he'd underestimated had been his executioner. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. The trial happened in October. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. But I followed the coverage obsessively, refreshing news sites every hour, reading every detail. The prosecution's case was airtight. They had everything: financial records, testimony from dozens of employees, emails where Richard had explicitly discussed how to avoid paying overtime, messages where he'd bragged about making people work for free. His defense tried to paint him as a demanding but fair boss, someone who expected excellence and was being punished for having high standards. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted him on 14 counts of fraud, wage theft, and tax evasion. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for December. I marked the date on my calendar. In November, I got my third promotion, senior consultant, a corner office with windows that overlooked Central Park, a salary that made my parents cry with pride when I told them. "We're so proud of you, Bao Bao," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Everything you've accomplished." "I worked hard," I said simply, "and I got lucky." But it wasn't luck. It was knowledge. It was strategy. It was refusing to accept the hand I'd been dealt the first time and demanding a reshuffle. December 15th arrived cold and clear. I took the day off work and went to the courthouse. I sat in the back of the gallery, anonymous in the crowd of journalists and curious onlookers. Richard was brought in wearing an expensive suit that couldn't hide how diminished he looked. The man who'd strode through his office like a king was now just another defendant, shoulders slumped, face gray. The judge read the sentence: 12 years in federal prison, plus restitution of $6.8 million to victims, plus fines. 12 years. Richard's lawyer immediately began talking about appeals, but the judge shut him down. Your client had every opportunity to operate his business legally and chose not to. He stole from his employees systematically and without remorse. This sentence is appropriate and just. Richard turned to look at the gallery as they led him away. His eyes swept across the crowd, searching for what? Sympathy? Allies? His gaze passed right over me. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was just another face in the crowd, just another person whose life he'd briefly touched and forgotten. He had no idea I was the reason he was here. I sat through the rest of the proceedings, through the impact statements from Sarah and David and others, through the final declarations and the closing of the case. Then I walked out of the courthouse and into the winter afternoon. I went to Central Park and found a bench near the reservoir. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I'd lived 2 lives now, one where I'd been a victim and one where I'd been a fighter. I knew which one I preferred. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, a colleague at Morrison & Lee who'd become something more over the past few months. Smart, kind, respectful. Everything Richard wasn't. How did it go? I'd told him I had a personal matter to attend to. He hadn't pressed for details. That was one of the things I loved about him. He trusted me to share what I wanted to share when I wanted to share it. Justice was served, I typed back. I'll tell you about it over dinner. I'll cook. Come over at 7. I smiled and pocketed my phone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city was transforming for evening. Office workers streaming towards subway stations, tourists taking photos, couples walking hand in hand. I sat there for a long time, watching the light fade, feeling the cold seep through my coat. I was 31 years old. I'd died and been reborn. I'd brought down a corrupt company and sent its CEO to prison. I'd rebuilt my career, my life, my sense of self, and I'd done it all without breaking the non-disparagement agreement I'd signed because I was smarter than Richard Hartwell. I'd always been smarter. He'd just been too arrogant to notice. I stood, brushed off my coat, and started walking toward the subway. I had dinner plans. I had a life to live. I had a future that stretched out before me, bright and full of possibility. The past was done. Richard was done. That chapter of my life, both versions of it, was closed. But as I descended into the subway station, surrounded by the noise and heat and humanity of New York, I allowed myself one final moment of satisfaction. I'd won. Completely, utterly, irrevocably. And Richard, Hartwell would spend the next 12 years in a cell, wondering how it had all gone wrong. He'd never know the answer. And I'd never tell. Some secrets were too delicious to share. 5 years later, I was the youngest partner in Morrison & Lee's history. The announcement came in March. Fitting, since March was the month I'd been reborn, the month I'd started fighting back. To Emma, my colleagues toasted at the celebration dinner. The hardest worker and sharpest mind in the firm. I raised my glass and smiled. If they only knew. I'd leveraged every advantage my rebirth had given me. I knew which clients to pursue and which to avoid. I knew which market trends were coming and which were dead ends. I knew which projects would succeed and which would fail. I'd played the game with perfect information and I'd dominated, but I'd also earned it. The long hours, the brilliant strategies, the client relationships I'd built, those were real. The rebirth gave me knowledge, but I'd turned that knowledge into results through genuine hard work. I was proud of what I'd accomplished. Marcus proposed to me in April. We were on vacation in Kyoto, standing in a garden full of cherry blossoms, and he got down on one knee with a ring his grandmother had worn. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said, "and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." I said yes. I'd told him about my first life, about the rebirth, during one of our early dates. I'd expected him to think I was crazy, to run away, to dismiss it as a metaphor or a mental health crisis. Instead, he'd listened. Really listened. "That explains a lot," he'd said when I finished. "You have this way of seeing around corners, of knowing things before they happen. I thought you were just incredibly perceptive. You believe me?" "Emma, I've learned that the universe is stranger than we imagine. If you say you lived through this before, I believe you. And I'm grateful you're using this. Second chance to build something beautiful." That was the moment I fell in love with him. We got married in September, a small ceremony with close friends and family. Sarah was my maid of honor. Tyler flew in from Seattle, where he'd started his own consulting firm, one that treated employees well and paid them fairly. My parents cried through the whole ceremony. Happy tears this time. At the reception, my father pulled me aside. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become, Emma. There was a time—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "A few years ago, you seemed lost. Like you were carrying a weight I couldn't see. But you found your way through it. You became stronger." He was talking about my first life, even though he didn't know it. He'd seen me struggle, seen me break, seen me barely surviving. He didn't know that version of me had died and been replaced by someone harder, sharper, more determined. "I had good teachers," I said, hugging him. "You and Mom showed me what it means to persevere." The party went late into the night. We danced and laughed and celebrated. I looked around at the people I loved, the life I'd built, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd made it count. But sometimes, late at night, I still thought about Richard. He was 5 years into his sentence. I'd checked on him once, using connections to access public records. He was housed in a medium security facility in Pennsylvania. No early release, no special privileges. Just time. Years and years of time to think about what he'd done, what he'd lost. I wondered if he ever thought about the non-disparagement agreement. If he ever remembered the quiet woman who'd signed it without protest, who'd taken her severance and disappeared. If he ever wondered if she'd had anything to do with his downfall. Probably not. Men like Richard never suspected women like me. We were invisible to them, beneath their notice. That had been my greatest weapon. I never spoke about Hartwell Consulting Group. I honored the non-disparagement agreement to the letter. When people asked about my previous employment, I gave vague answers and changed the subject. The agreement said I couldn't disparage the company or its leadership, and I never did. I just let the Department of Labor do it for me. I just let the evidence speak. I just let justice run its course. The law was a beautiful thing when you understood how to use it. 10 years after my rebirth, I was living a life I couldn't have imagined in my first timeline. Partner at a prestigious firm, married to a man I loved, a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn, financial security, respect, power. But more than any of that, freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from the weight of what Richard had done to me, freedom from the victim I'd been. I'd transformed pain into purpose, trauma into triumph. And every single day, I was grateful for the bus. That sounded insane, I knew, but it was true. The bus had killed me, and in dying, I'd been given the greatest gift imaginable, a chance to rewrite my story. I'd taken that chance and turned it into a weapon. On March 15th, the 10-year anniversary, I took the day off. Marcus understood. I always took this day off, though I'd never fully explained why. I went back to the corner where I'd died, the intersection in Midtown where I'd stepped off the curb without looking. It looked the same. Same buildings, same traffic, same chaos. A different bus rumbled past, and I felt nothing. No fear, no trauma, just acknowledgement. I'd died here, and I'd been reborn. From this corner, I'd launched a campaign that destroyed a corrupt company, sent a criminal to prison, and gave justice to dozens of people who'd been hurt. From this corner, I'd started building the life I deserved. I stood there for a while, remembering both versions of myself. The broken woman who'd stepped into traffic, the warrior who'd woken up with fire in her veins. Then I walked away. I had lunch at a cafe I loved, spent the afternoon reading in Central Park, went home to cook dinner with my husband. It was an ordinary day. A perfect day. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Hello? Emma Chen? A woman's voice, professional but uncertain. Speaking. This is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a reporter with The Times. I'm working on a retrospective piece about the Hartwell Consulting case. It's been 10 years since the Department of Labor investigation, and we're looking at the long-term impact. I was hoping to speak with you. My heart skipped. I don't think I have anything to say. I understand you signed a non-disparagement agreement, but I'm not asking you to disparage anyone. I'm just interested in your experience as an employee and how the investigation affected your life afterward. I appreciate the call, but I'll have to decline. Could I ask, and you don't have to answer, but there's been speculation over the years about who initially reported Hartwell to the Department of Labor. The whistleblower's identity was sealed, but some people believe I hung up. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. 10 years and people were still trying to figure it out. 10 years, and my secret was still safe. Marcus looked up from his book. Everything okay? Fine, I said. Just a reporter fishing for a story. About? Old history. Nothing important. He accepted this and went back to reading. He knew I had boundaries, secrets I kept even from him. He respected that. I climbed into bed beside him, but sleep didn't come easily. The reporter's call had stirred up memories I usually kept locked away. The fear I'd felt walking into the Department of Labor that first time, the uncertainty of whether my evidence would be enough. The long months of investigation, wondering if it would actually work. It had worked, better than I'd dreamed. But success came with its own burden. The weight of secrecy, of knowing something no one else knew, of carrying a truth that could never be shared. I was the ghost in the machine of Richard Hartwell's destruction. The invisible hand that had pushed the first domino. And I'd stay invisible forever. Because the non-disparagement agreement protected me as much as it had been meant to silence me. As long as I honored it, as long as I never spoke publicly about what happened, no one could connect me to the investigation. I'd built the perfect trap, and Richard had locked himself inside without ever knowing I'd held the key. 15 years after my rebirth, Richard Hartwell was released from prison. I saw the notification in my newsfeed. He'd served 12 years, gotten a few years off for good behavior. He was 63 years old now. Gray. thin, broken. The article included a recent photo. He looked nothing like the predator who'd stalked the halls of Hartwell Consulting Group. He looked like someone who'd been hollowed out and discarded. I felt nothing. Well, that wasn't quite true. I felt satisfaction. The cold, distant satisfaction of watching a corrupt system finally punish someone who deserved it. But no anger, no fear, no lingering trauma. He was just a man now, a convicted felon with limited job prospects and a ruined reputation. He'd never work in consulting again. He'd never have power over anyone again. He'd live out the rest of his life in obscurity, exactly as he deserved. I closed the article and went about my day. I had a board meeting to prepare for. Morrison & Lee was expanding, opening offices in London and Singapore, and I was leading the international division. I had real work to do, important work that mattered. Richard Hartwell was a footnote in my history. Nothing more. That evening, I met Sarah for drinks. We did this monthly, though tradition we'd maintained for over a decade. "Did you see that Hartwell got out?" she asked, nursing her martini. "I did. How do you feel about it?" "Honestly, I don't feel much of anything. He served his time. He's not a threat anymore." Sarah studied me. "You're amazing. You know that? The way you've moved past everything that happened there. I still have nightmares sometimes." "Therapy helps," I said. "And perspective. What he did to us was terrible, but we survived. We thrived. He lost everything. That's justice." "I guess." She sipped her drink. "I still wonder sometimes who reported him. Whoever it was, they saved a lot of people from future harm." I met her eyes. "Yeah, they did." Did she suspect? Sometimes I thought maybe she did, that she'd put together the timeline and figured it out. But she never asked directly, and I never confirmed. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. We changed the subject, talked about her upcoming promotion, my daughter's soccer tournament, the renovation Marcus and I were planning. Normal life. Beautiful, ordinary, hard-won normal life. 20 years after my rebirth, I published a book. Not about Hartwell Consulting, not about workplace abuse or corruption or revenge. About resilience. About second chances. About the power of strategic thinking and long-term planning in career development. The long game. Building success. Through strategic patience became a bestseller. Companies brought me in to speak. Business schools used it as a textbook. I went on tour, gave interviews, built a brand around the idea that true success came from thinking 3 moves ahead. No one knew the real inspiration for the book. No one knew I'd literally had the chance to think 3 moves ahead, to replay the game with perfect knowledge. The book made me wealthy beyond anything my consulting work had achieved. I could have retired, but I didn't. I loved the work. I loved building things, solving problems, helping clients succeed. I was good at it. Better than anyone. At a speaking engagement in Boston, during the Q&A, a young woman stood up. "Ms. Chen, you talk a lot about learning from failure and using setbacks as opportunities. Can you share a specific example from your own career?" I paused. I had a dozen safe answers prepared. Generic stories about lost clients or failed projects. But something about the way she asked, the eagerness in her eyes, reminded me of my younger self. "Early in my career," I said carefully, "I worked for a company that was deeply corrupt. I saw systematic abuse, fraud, theft, and at first, I didn't know what to do. I felt powerless." The audience was silent, listening. But I learned something important. Documentation is power. Evidence is power. The system works sometimes if you understand how to use it. I gathered information. I found the right people to talk to. And eventually, justice happened. "What happened to the company?" someone called out. "Doesn't exist anymore. The people who ran it faced consequences. And the people who were hurt got some measure of compensation and vindication." "Were you scared when you spoke up?" "Terrified," I admitted. But I was more scared of staying silent, of letting them win. Sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something matters more than your fear. The applause was thunderous. After the event, the young woman found me. "Thank you," she said. "I'm dealing with something similar at my job. I've been afraid to report it, but hearing you talk about it It gave me courage. I pulled out my card. Here's my email. If you need advice on how to document things or who to contact, reach out. I'm happy to help. Her eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Really? I watched her walk away, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I'd been given a second chance. I'd used it to save myself. But maybe I could use my experience to save others too. 25 years after my rebirth, Richard Hartwell died. Heart attack. He was 73, alone in a studio apartment in Tampa. I saw the obituary online. It was brief. No family mentioned, no achievements listed beyond his early career successes. The Hartwell consulting scandal was referenced in a single line. His later career was marred by legal troubles. Marred. What a gentle word for complete destruction. I read the obituary twice, then closed my laptop. I felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, not even relief. He was just gone, a problem that had solved itself through time and mortality. I told Marcus over dinner that night, "How do you feel?" He asked. "Like closing a book I finished reading years ago? It's done. It doesn't matter anymore." "It mattered once." "Once," I agreed. "But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the woman he hurt. I'm not even the woman who brought him down. I'm someone completely different now." And it was true. I'd lived an entire second life since my rebirth. I'd built a career, a family, a legacy that had nothing to do with Richard Hartwell or the company he'd destroyed through his own greed. I was 56 years old now. My daughter was finishing college. My son was in high school. I was a grandmother, though I didn't feel old enough for the title. I'd served on boards, mentored hundreds of young professionals, built systems and structures that helped people succeed. I'd used my second chance to make the world a little bit better. That was the real victory. Not destroying Richard, though that had been satisfying, but building something meaningful from the ashes of my first life. 30 years after my rebirth, on March 15th, I woke up in my bed and wondered if it would happen again. I was 61 years old. Would I get another chance? Another reset? I lay there for a long time, waiting, half hoping, half afraid. But nothing happened. The clock ticked forward. The day proceeded. Normally. It had been a one-time gift then. Or maybe a one-time curse, depending on how you looked at it. I got up, made coffee, and sat on my back porch watching the sunrise. I'd lived 2 lives, technically, but really, I'd lived one life twice, with the second iteration informed by the first. What would I have done differently if I'd known I wouldn't get another reset? Nothing, I realized. I'd made the right choices. I'd fought the right battles. I'd built something worth building. Marcus joined me on the porch, handing me a fresh cup of coffee. "Happy rebirth day," he said. It was a private joke between us. This anniversary, he was the only one who understood. "Thank you. Any regrets?" "None," I said, and meant it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. I'd been given an impossible gift, the chance to undo my biggest mistakes, to right the wrongs that had been done to me, to rebuild from a place of knowledge and power. I'd used it well. And now, in the golden years of my second life, I could rest knowing I'd made it count. The non-disparagement agreement I'd signed all those years ago was in a box somewhere, probably destroyed when Hartwell Consulting's files were liquidated in bankruptcy. Even if it existed, it didn't matter. I'd never broken it. I'd never spoken publicly about Richard Hartwell or his company. I'd just let the truth destroy him, brick by brick, piece by piece. And in the end, justice had been served without me ever saying a word. That was the beauty of it. That was the perfection. I'd beaten him by playing a longer game than he even knew existed. I smiled into my coffee and watched the sun climb higher into the sky. It was going to be a beautiful day.